This Tuesday, January 28th, this afternoon. We're going to look into understanding the state of law for actually, is it driving under the influence or driving while intoxicated? The witnesses can correct me. Down as driving while intoxicated, but I understand it's also referred to as DUI or driving under the influence. But we're going to talk about what folks are seeing in law enforcement as far as what kind of items people are impaired with, drugs and alcohol. We're going to hear about the DRE program. We're going to hear about the state of our law, what folks are seeing as far as where the trends are. So we're going to start with Dr. Tricia Conti. If you could join us. And if you could identify yourself for the record. Thank you for being here.
It's been a hot minute. So thank you all for having me today. It's Trish Conti. I'm director of the Vermont Forensic Laboratory. I know I've seen many of you oftentimes in the past, but it's a pleasure to meet some new faces. So I think what would be helpful before I dive into the data that we see is just to give you a brief overview on the testing that we do at the Vermont Forensic Laboratory when it relates to driving under the influence cases. So at the VFL, which is the state's only forensic laboratory, we do all impaired driving testing for the state. So if a driver is arrested for driving under the influence, depending on whether it's suspected an alcohol or a drug case, they take different paths. So if it's an alcohol only case, what'll happen is they'll get arrested, brought back to the police agency, and ideally they will, as part of the end of processing, they will take a breath test on what's called a Data Master DMT. So it's an instrument that looks kind of like an old school typewriter that has some solutions floating around in a jar. And so an operator will blow into it and it will collect a sample of their breath. And the instrument will instantly tell the officer what the calculated blood alcohol or breath alcohol concentration is. So it's at that point in time that they'll know whether they're over the legal limit, which is 0.8, or not. If there is a case where an operator cannot provide a breath sample, whether it be the instrument's not available or there's something wrong with the operator's mouth or they have a medical condition, then they are given the opportunity to have a blood sample drawn. If they consent to that, they will either be taken to a local emergency room, or there's a handful of rescue agencies around the state which will actually come to the station and do a blood draw there so they don't have to go through the hospital. So those blood samples will come to our laboratory for analysis. We are also in charge of maintaining all of those Data Master DMTs that are around the state. So we adjust them, we calibrate them, we deploy them to the field, and we train all of the officers on how to use them. And we will testify in court as to what the instruments do and what it means and what the impairing effects of alcohol are. So kind of taking a divergent path now. So if you have that blood sample that comes to us, we will test that for blood alcohol using an instrument that we have at the lab. So the alcohol path is fairly straightforward because there's a set limit for what's allowable for driving in a state. If you take an operator who is suspected of being under the influence of something other than alcohol, something like a drug, or a combination of alcohol and drugs, their only path forward is to have that blood sample drawn. So if an officer suspects that, the next step they will take is to request a DRE, a drug recognition expert officer, to come respond. Some officers, it might be the arresting officer, is also certified as a DRE. But in most cases, they're not. So they will put a call out to have a DRE respond. The DRE will come, go through their process, which John Flanagan will talk about momentarily. But at the end of that, the operator is then given the option to have a blood sample taken. Same process as before. So if they consent, they will have that blood sample drawn. It'll come to our lab. So when we receive these samples, and we receive anywhere from 500 to 800 samples a year, blood samples, and that's either alcohol by itself, drugs by itself, or a combination of the two. We will test those. And what we look for the drug side of things is the most commonly impaired drugs or substances that we see in the state of Vermont. Now, those drugs can be anything from cocaine, heroin, fentanyl, some prescription medications, methamphetamine, pretty much the most common things that you'll see in impaired driving. Now, we're not looking for prescription medications or things like that, like blood pressure medication, birth control pills, nothing like that. We only look for impairing drugs.
Did you mention THC as well?
Yes, we also will detect cannabinoids in our samples. Yes, so marijuana use. I did go through and pull some data on kind of trends we've seen and looking like at a 5-year retrospective look back. And I will provide these to the committee after, but I wanted to kind of verbally go over them before I disseminate anything because it's a lot to digest. And there's a few important take-home messages. If you're looking at the alcohol side of things, those data master DMTs are all networked to a central computer that we have at our laboratories. So we have a live look in and are able to compile all of that data. So we can go back over year and look at trends as far as like age of operator, time of the arrest, average BAC, and just see if there's any changes in that over time. We looked at 2023 data versus 2024 data to see if there was anything interesting. And the numbers are oddly enough nearly identical year over year. With the average age of an operator that gets arrested for DUI is late 30s. And most of the stops and arrests are occurring at night, which is not surprising. The average alcohol concentration is a 0.14, so nearly double the legal limit. So that's looking at all of those cases and arrests. And these could be just, defective equipment, anything from as simple as that to like interlane weaving to crashes. Whatever the reason for the stop is. So, yeah.
So when you say defective equipment, do you mean the car is defective or you mean the data master?
The car is defective. I was talking about the reason for the stop.
Okay.
Yes.
And is this like, I sort of am having a memory from many years ago. Is this a little bit also like defibrillators where there has to be like routine maintenance done to make sure that the data masters are not issue?
Absolutely. Yes. So we perform at a minimum manually. We put hands on every instrument that's around the state. So we make sure that they're operating functionally. In addition to the maintenance that we provide, we have operators that are trained to a higher level at every agency, and they're called DMT supervisors. And they will perform quarterly maintenance on the instruments and also change the solutions and other kind of less complicated tasks that go along with maintaining them. But yes, we routinely service the instruments around the state. Yes. So moving into the drug data, because I think this is really important. We've been testing our own blood samples at the forensic lab since 2019. So we have over 5 years of data now to look back and look at trends. And I think historically, what we saw a lot of in the state was marijuana and benzodiazepines. And that has shifted, which is not surprising when you look at the illegal drug market in the state, which I've testified before this committee too as well, when it comes to heroin and fentanyl and opiates. And that's mirrored in what we see with impaired driving. So that predominant drugs that we're finding in these blood samples taken are opiates and cocaine. And upwards of like over 50% of the cases we see have those drugs in them. And it's unusual to have only one substance on board. What's actually more common is that folks have either 2 to 3 categories of drugs on board. And when I mention categories, that means 2 different drugs that have different mechanisms of action. So it could be their central nervous suppressants and stimulants on board. So think of something like an opioid or cocaine. So I think that's important to think about is you're not talking about somebody who's getting arrested and pulled over because they're accidentally took too much of their prescription medication or were prescribed something by their doctor and is having an adverse effect. These are people who are intentionally abusing drugs and then choosing to drive. So again, I'll provide these stats, but I think those are the biggest takeaways. I don't think folks realize that the cocaine addiction problem in the state is as bad as it is. We actually see cocaine in probably more samples than we see opioids. I think folks had this thought that it kind of went away in the 80s and 90s, but it's reared back with an ugly head. And I think that has to do with cost of drugs and what's available out there.
Just a quick question. Is a lot of, in terms of who the offenders are most of them in-state incidents or are some out of state as well?
It would be both. I can't speak to specific numbers. One of the things we do record during processing in that And that data that's entered into the instruments is license number.
Sure.
But again, if somebody hasn't updated their license, they might be a Vermont resident or they might be coming through. But I don't have specifics on
I guess maybe in terms of where the cars are registered.
that. I don't know. I would have to defer to some of my colleagues that
Sure.
are sitting behind.
I'm just curious, because
Yeah.
I imagine like ski season
Mhm.
and, obviously there's just so much out of state presence in the state regardless. I just would be curious of how that breaks down.
Sure. And that might be something that we might be able to data mine. I don't know if it has already been.
Thank you.
So I'm wondering, because I know there was a lot of discussion when we were looking at legalizing cannabis of what that would end up doing. And I'm just wondering what trends you saw when cannabis retail came online.
Sure. What I can tell you, and I can dive deeper into the cannabis data, looking back at 2021, because I only have 21 through 24 data here on my little chart. In the samples that we tested, just about 50% were positive for THC. And in our 2024 data, that number is down to about 47%. So I don't know if it's significant, but it's about the same. I would say it's no better, no worse.
But did you see, because there was some speculation that we would see opioid numbers coming down or alcohol numbers coming down, but no.
Definitely not. I think
Okay.
if anything, overall, it's gone up across the board.
Great question. Yes, before 2019, when was the testing done?
So backtrack to 2012. Before then, all of the DUI testing in Vermont was performed by the Department of Health. And through a legislative change that was transferred the authority of it to the Department of Public Safety to our laboratory. So we took ownership of that in 2012. At that point in time, we did not have the resources to do the drug testing in state. So those samples were shipped to a private independent lab in Pennsylvania called NMS Labs. So it was done there until we spent about close to $1 million of highway safety funds that were given to us to the Highway Safety Office to purchase instrumentation and renovate our lab space and add additional personnel to bring that on board.
I think I'm gonna embarrass myself, but did we do that in here? Okay.
I don't know exactly who did it, but whoever it was, thank you, I guess. Yeah.
It wasn't here, but I think it was
Yeah.
either appropriations or I thought it was out of the capital budget, but I could be misremembering.
Benzodiazepine.
Mhm.
What is it?
So those are things like Valium, anti-anxiety, anti-depression medication that a lot of people are prescribed and on across the board. Yeah. And we do detect some of those, but it's rare for us to test a sample that has only benzodiazepines on board. Most of them have that in combination with multitude of other drugs.
So if you found just benzodiazepine, would you continue the investigation to see if they had a script on it?
So that would be where the law enforcement comes into play.
Right.
Yep. So they are able to make an affirmative defense saying that this is my prescribed medication, and then they could bring in their doctor and go over prescribing medication, but that's all down the criminal justice adjudication pathway. All we do is test a sample to find out what's in
I
it.
didn't figure you would do the investigation, just in general.
Correct.
Thank you.
Questions? Thank you very much, Dr. Cook. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
So next go to John Flanagan. Used to be corporal, I'm trying to remember, because we've had you in here before when you,
I was gonna say, it's been about 6 years since I've been here.
Yes.
Well, I'll introduce myself first and we'll talk a little bit about that, but John Flanagan. I'm currently a contractor to the Vermont Criminal Justice Council, who manages the drug evaluation and classification program for the state of Vermont. My previous life, I retired as a lieutenant for Vermont State Police. Traffic operations, then it became safety programs. So I'd been in this room many times for many years, and there's still some familiar faces and some new faces here. So thank you for having me. And I just wanted to discuss sort of the drug evaluation and classification program for those who are not familiar with it. The program itself is managed internationally by the International Chiefs of Police. Association of Chiefs of Police with oversight and support from the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. Was developed in the late 80s. Vermont was a little late to get into that program and train specialized drug recognition evaluators or experts, if you will, which started back in 2005. And I was fortunate enough to be one of the first 5 DREs that were trained almost 20 years ago. And here I am, I'm still involved. So I wanted to just update you. What's that?
Were you a trainer?
I was not. I did not become an instructor. I became a lieutenant, and they don't let lieutenants become instructors at that point. So I wish I was, but I'm still involved in the program, and I'm happy to be part of that through the council and with the great support that we get from the Highway Safety Office with 405, mostly 405D NHTSA funds. And most of the needs for the program are met through the Highway Safety Office. Like I said, they're very supportive. There's a couple of things that are prohibitive, are not allowable for funding, and I'll discuss that here shortly. So just the state of the program right now, and I think you all have a handout. The 2024 information has not yet been finalized. So I've just given you some 2023 data to take a look at that. And currently, as of now, we have 43 certified DRE officers in Vermont, which include 10 from Vermont State Police, 1 from Vermont Department of Liquor and Lottery, 1 from Vermont DMV. And then we have 31 local and sheriff officers that include Bennington, Berlin, Burlington, Colchester, Dover, Essex, Hartford, Lyndonville, Manchester, Middlebury, Milton, Orleans Sheriff's Department, Randolph, South Burlington, St. Albans, Virgins, Williston, Wilmington, Windsor Sheriff's Department, and Winhall Police Departments. We have been averaging of just under 400 enforcement evaluations over the last 3 years, or just under that. Like I said, I don't have the finals for this year, but we will come to close to that figure again. And those are responses that agencies have put out mostly through the emergency management BT alert system, if you're familiar with that. That's something that we utilize through the Williston Vermont State Police PSAP. When an agency suspects they have someone who's operating under the influence of a substance other than alcohol or in addition to alcohol, they mostly will utilize that system unless they have someone that's in-house and it's available to get a quick response to the scene or to the department or even to a hospital if that person's been injured, say in a crash. And we average probably about 400 of those BT alerts per year. And I had to say every one of those calls does not get a response. With 43 officers around the state, we certainly have some pockets, but we're averaging last year about 75% response rate to those calls.
Let me make sure I understand. So the call goes out to the 43 people and there's some way to say, yes, I can come out and do an
Yes.
evaluation.
They will call the PSAP and say that I'm on my way.
And the PSAP stands for what?
Primary Service Answering Point. Actually, the way that the alerts are set up, there's in regions. So there's a northeast, northwest, southeast, southwest region. So just all these folks are inundated with 400 pages and mass phone calls and texts. So that's the way that works. As Dr. Conti said, we're seeing, I do track some of the toxicology trends that are specific to DRE cases because there are those 25% that do not get a DRE response. And there are sometimes where they're not contacted because of some reasons of a person not cooperating and other factors. But we are seeing something similar. The top 3 drug categories as of now are narcotic analgesics. So she talked about, Dr. Conti, about opioids, cannabis, and central nervous system stimulants. And most of those, we see quite a few as poly category cases where we have all 3 of those involved. Those are probably the most poly category cases we see is all three of those substances in one toxicology sample.
It's Ken has a question.
What's a central nervous stimulants? What category is that?
Well, that would be something like a substance of cocaine, amphetamine, methamphetamine.
So same old stuff that we've been dealing with.
Yes.
Right, yes. Okay.
So I would say that probably the most common combinations that we're seeing right now, Dr. Natigan, is probably cocaine and fentanyl, one of the top drug combinations that we're seeing.
So I probably should have asked Doctor this, but when did cocaine make the comeback that it's making?
Last 2 or 3 years, I would say.
This is on that as well.
We're not suspicious of what particular compound it's in, is it? Are we, I mean, are you talking powdered cocaine or crack cocaine or?
Well, we don't know it as far as it's going to come back as far as positive toxicology in the same way.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, go ahead, Ken.
May I? So is the cocaine laced with all kinds of extra stuff too, just like most of this other stuff?
It's possible, depending upon what the lab is detecting in those samples. There's some substances that may be laced that they don't detect in their screening process.
Dr. Conti, could you?
Yeah, if I may.
Yeah.
So speaking from the analysis of the actual regulated drugs perspective, not blood samples right now. So the cocaine samples that we test in the lab are almost always pure. So they might have something like a adulterant in it or some sort of filler, things like phenacetin or just some other chemical that's used to add into it, so it's not pure, like 100% powder cocaine. But there's usually only like 1 or 2 things which are common in cocaine. When we look at the powder heroin or fentanyl samples, those you'll see anywhere from 5 to 10 different peaks or compounds of interest in it. So you could have heroin, fentanyl, xylazine. Sometimes there's ketamine in there or methamphetamine, fillers, different synthetic analogs. It's everything from the kitchen sink. Whereas the cocaine that we're seeing is pretty clear and clean. So we usually don't see cocaine that's been adulterated. If that answers your question.
And you're testing all this up at the lab that I visited
Yes.
on legislative day, right?
Yes.
Thank you.
Karen.
Apologize if you covered this and I just let it go over my head with this. So we heard the testimony about like the samples that actually go to the forensic lab and those numbers. And this is with the DREs. And so seeing these numbers. So are these? Part of it is you're going out there and not assuming, you're skilled assessing what drug it is. That's what's listed here, but then is it also then confirmed with a lab result?
It is, yes.
Okay, so
Yes.
these numbers here are all confirmed. Or how does that work?
Yes, these are
If you
numbers-
go out and you're like, I think this is what I'm witnessing or observing, and then it gets confirmed, or
Right.
maybe it doesn't.
It does. So what's on here is what the DRE's opinion was once the evaluation was completed.
Okay.
And then that sample is sent to the lab for confirmation.
Okay.
So the toxicology refusals are people who refuse to allow blood to be drawn?
Yes, that's correct. And many of those cases, and I'm sure Dennis will probably talk to this, whereas there's a search warrant that is sought in those cases too. And where people still refuse to provide a sample.
So Ian and then Karen.
Do you have just a
I
follow-up?
have a follow-up to,
Ian.
I'm just trying to understand how the system all works.
Okay.
So do you find that often the numbers are the same of like what the DRE's opinion is versus when it goes to lab, does it match up or?
It matches up most of the time. I mean, the DRE is making an opinion based upon really well over 100 different pieces of information. And even though that there may be a drug that may be active, it may be at a very, very low amount. So the signs that you would expect to see with that drug may not be present with that individual, but other drug categories may be present. So that's a factor that has to be considered as well.
And assuming it's just a continuous learning cycle too, that you then collect the feedback from what, like, oh, like.
Of course, yeah. I mean, they're learning as they continue and they're getting better with their craft. And they're continuously they're required to do at least 4 enforcement evaluations per 2 years to keep their certification. One has to be witnessed by an instructor. They have to attend at least 8 hours of in-service training. They have to provide an updated curriculum vitae. They have to keep a rolling log of all the evaluations that they're providing. And every one of our evaluations, these are all evaluations that are either fully completed or maybe partial evaluations where someone isn't participating or stops during the process, but they're still able to make observations of impairment. And it's important to remember that some of these cases involve folks who they find that are not impaired at the time of the evaluation, even though there may have been signs of impairment at roadside. And then there are medical conditions sometimes that the DREs are trained to look for and determine that this is not substance impairment, this is a medical impairment. And sometimes they're able to refer them to get appropriate medical care.
Ian.
And I'm sorry to interrupt your testimony, but we're talking process. I just had a quick, just so I understand, is a DRE necessary for the responding officer on a DUI stop to order an evidentiary blood test?
No, it's not. The law allows that the officer, if a DRE isn't, they can get a blood test. And just not to take too much away from Dennis, I'm sure he'll get into some of the legal aspects of why a DRE is important for a case to go forward.
So it's more building the case for, yeah. So it kind of is serving the role of like the roadside breath test. If it was an alcohol, like it's a non-evidentiary, but it's giving the officer more information to then build a case if it's a narcotic or something.
Well, it wouldn't be taking a blood test until after the evaluation, and then it would be done by a medical professional as far as the blood draw.
Understood. So the DRE though is kind of serving the role of a like initial assessment.
Well, yeah, I mean, they're confirming the suspicions that officer has at roadside. The DRE isn't coming to roadside; they'd be coming back, to a police station, for example.
Yeah. Okay.
And do that evaluation in its entirety. That's the goal.
Something other than alcohol is being suspected.
Yes.
And the DRE essentially is providing what's necessary for probable cause for a search warrant. Is that?
Sometimes that is helpful, but there's been different opinions in different districts about that. Whether the lay officer can provide that information for a search warrant. Dennis, if you wanted to chime in real quick on that, but
Want to just
No.
that and come on.
there's been some debate about that, so there hasn't been consistency, if you can imagine that.
In here, we can imagine it.
The other thing I would add too is that the last 5 years, about 27% of all the DRE evaluations involved a crash. That's not in the report. 27%. It's about our 5-year average right now. One of our biggest challenges in the program right now is recruiting and retention, kind of like the police profession in a lot of ways. I think a lot of that happened during COVID, where we actually had 58 DREs statewide, and we went down to 38 the end of last year.
You have what, 41 now? Is that what you?
We're at 43 now, yes. And we just closed a application period that was open for several months on the Vermont Criminal Justice Council website, as well as we would notify department heads and others about the training. And we have interviews tomorrow, and the unfortunate part is we only have 7 applicants statewide. So
Same issue that we're having all across law enforcement and all across all employers too, for that matter. How about it?
For someone to be a DRE trained person, must they be in law enforcement, or might it be somebody in the medical profession? Or
it must be in law enforcement or in a criminal justice field. That's by the international standards. States can do their own, well, they could add enhanced standards, which we have some enhanced standards that's been done by the oversight committee. And one of the things that we require now is that officer be level 3 certified officer. for the purposes of this training. And then the other things about us, are they having at least 2 years of law enforcement experience, experience in DUI investigations, things like that.
So why level three? I'm curious.
Well, that's something that the committee decided to do just because of the
committee being
oversight committee from the Drug Evaluation and Classification Program.
at the Vermont Criminal Justice Council?
Yes, it's
Okay.
it's made up of several people, like sheriffs, a chief's representative, the lab. So about 10 members of that committee. And you know what, if you look at the training requirements of the class, I went through it. There's no question it was one of the toughest trainings I ever had in my law enforcement career. So we're really looking it's a very exclusive. We want the best of the best to be doing this. We don't want to set them up for failure. We're talking about 3 weeks of training, whereas, a level 2 officer, potentially could be more training than they got initially for their certification.
Right. Okay, thanks.
So that continues to be a little bit of a struggle for us in the program. We've looked into types of incentives, recognition, awards, pins, sending them to trainings out of state, conferences, et cetera. We're still looking for something more to, obviously they've got to want to do this kind of work. It's not for every law enforcement officer. And we, under federal money, like I said, all of our needs are met, except, we've had this idea of looking at maybe a stipend to offer incentive for training, and then for DRE officers to recertify every 2 years. But that's not something that the council is looking to fund. And if it was something, it would have to be fully funded by the legislature.
If that request has been advanced by the Department of Public Safety or anybody else?
I believe it has not at this point, Mr. Chair. The other thing that I would like to address is
Before you go ahead, I apologize. I probably had a question.
Can you only recruit in state, or do you also recruit out of state?
no, we just recruit in state because every state has their own programs and they usually train their own officers.
But I just wondered, do people want to move to Vermont and be a DRE officer?
Yeah, that's a good idea. I don't think other states would really want us recruiting their officers out here, but I know it happens.
Yeah. Okay.
So
So
we were looking to have a New Hampshire officer that couldn't make their training come here, but their program doesn't want them to come here because of the funding for put them up at a hotel, et cetera. But we certainly take people in from out of state if they want to come into our training class. So the other thing is that we're looking at is a need for so-called green labs. If you've heard of those, but we do offer the basic SFST at the academy level for law enforcement officers. Yeah, standardized field sobriety tests. That's the basics that most, if not all, law enforcement officers go through. And then there's ARIDE, which is sort of the bridging the gap between SFST and DRE. And that's advanced roadside impaired driving enforcement, which is it's a 2-day class. But that gives them a good idea of picking up on clues of drug impairment other than alcohol.
You have to do a ride before you become a DRE.
You do, yes, that is a requirement. But now with retail and legalization, Green Labs, part of the training is taking a deep dive of specifically cannabis impairment, which ARIDE touches on, but we're not at the point where we can dose people with all kinds of drugs, but now we're at a point where people can be dosed with cannabis, and it's a good hands-on learning experience for officers, knowing what that looks like, what the signs are and effects of cannabis impairment. As long as we're in good legal ground and we're not in a public space, there's ways that, and there's some work to work up to be able to do that. But again, that is prohibited with federal funds.
Right.
So we are looking for some options with that too. And I think it's probably really low cost, especially if people buy their own cannabis product that's packaged, so we know what it is, and they they bring it in. And we could buy them lunch.
I want it.
But there are some grant funds out there. One, responsibility.org. If you've heard of them, we're looking for them to open up something that we may have an opportunity to apply for providing that type of training in the future. I think that's covered about all I want to cover. Happy to answer any other questions.
Been peppering you with questions as you've been testing. Any
other questions?
I think we're good. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So we will now go to Dennis Wigmans, or did I mispronounce? Did I call
Got it right. In the old country, it's Vikman.
What's that?
It's Vikman in the old country.
Oh, well.
I shut on somebody speak Dutch.
All right, Dennis Weichmann, welcome.
I'm gonna use my phone. I have some notes on there, just so you don't think I'm cruising the internet here. Thanks for having me. My name is Dennis Wigmans. I'm what's known as a traffic safety resource prosecutor. It is, at least by last information, a federally funded position. Don't know, based on certain letters that maybe were published last night. But there are a number of us throughout the country. We work with law enforcement, we work with prosecutors, we work with schools, we work with government, we work with judges to teach them about traffic safety matters. The state of Vermont is lucky enough to have two. Myself and Matt Dwelzel over here in the corner is our most recent hire. Matt was a deputy up in Franklin County. Some of you may know me from my previous position. I was the state's attorney in Addison County for 6 years. Before that, I was a domestic and sexual violence prosecutor. And yet before that, I was a private attorney and a public defender. So I've sat on both sides in my 20 some odd years as an attorney. I'll start out by explaining that Vermont's doing a good job as far as highway safety is concerned. We spend our resources well. We don't have a lot of them, but it shows. We're one of the safest rural states in the country to operate a motor vehicle. We have some of the lowest numbers as far as fatalities per 100,000 population and so on. But I think it's a testament to the work that's done by the people out in the field, the legislators, and passing good law, and our judges at being a discerning group of individuals who really look at the facts by and large. That doesn't mean, however, that the challenges aren't there, as you've heard so far. For example, we have a very alarming increase in our DUI drug population. And to start off, we also are talking about driving under the influence. It's not driving while intoxicated, because intoxicated is actually a higher standard it's a higher degree of impairment. When we're talking about DUI in Vermont, it's to the slightest degree. Any mental or physical capability that's diminished in any amount by a substance. And, just to put a pin in it, we're the 8th safest state overall based on fatalities in the country.
Per capita? Is that how?
Per capita, yes. Yes, per 100,000 persons. So part of that, as I said, is also a lot to do with law enforcement and their preparation. Our academy has a week-long DUI program. I help as one of the instructors in that to explain DUI law. We have there what's called a wet lab, where participants come in and are dosed, and then the officers get to see firsthand how alcohol affects individuals, and they are able to run the field sobriety tests, including what's called horizontal gaze nystagmus, which is a phenomenon that's caused by alcohol. and the gaze. It used to be called alcohol gaze nystagmus. They changed it to horizontal gaze nystagmus because there are other central nervous system depressants. I think everybody's aware that alcohol is a depressant, and there are others that also cause the same phenomenon.
But before you go, I think Barbara had a question.
Sure.
So you said that, sorry, let me pull my note back up here, that the definition of driving while impaired is any drug that has an impact, is that what you said?
So our standard for alcohol is a little bit different than our standard for drugs. Alcohol is impaired to the slightest degree with no other, element to it. Okay. For drugs, it's impaired to, well, it's actually impaired by a drug to a degree that makes it one, unsafe to drive to the slightest degree.
So
It's kind of complicated, but it's
Yeah, but-
very close to the same
but
standard.
I guess I'm wondering like that, like, for example, if you have 2 teaspoons of alcohol, like it's possible that it is impairing you to the slightest degree.
It could be, scientifically speaking. So for example, we have 2 DUI standards
Right.
as it relates to alcohol. One is the per se limit, which is 0.08.
Or-
And then we have the to the slightest degree, impaired to the slightest degree. Scientifically speaking, impairments arrive usually at around 0.02. You'll see, especially ocular impairments, that is gaze nystagmus, for example, where people have a hard time focusing on items, but virtually everyone is impaired at 0.05.
And for drugs, I feel like I read something a while ago when it was talking about distracted driving and
Sure.
like taking, I want to say taking like ASIF, an over-the-counter, I don't want to use a name brand, but just taking a generic over-the-counter, like Advil or
Sure.
impairs people to this. Like it was just comparing like what things can impair people.
Sure. So I think by and large, and I'm not going out on a limb here, and certainly Dr. Conti can testify to that much more expressively than I can, but it's incredibly rare for a person to be impaired by acetaminophen, for example. We're talking about substances that would typically impair a person that fall under the 7 drug categories. We're talking about central nervous system depressants, central nervous system stimulants, cannabis, hallucinogens, inhalants, which might be, there are people that take Axe body spray, for example, and will inhale it to the point where they are impaired. Talking about the narcotic analgesics like opioids and opiates. We're talking about those categories of drugs really when we're talking about impairing substances and substances that are known to impair. That might include, for example, we've heard testimony about prescription medications. Some prescription medications do impair people. And I think everybody's familiar with those little yellow or orange stickers that say don't operate heavy equipment. Motor vehicles, they're heavy equipment. So there is 1201H, 23 VSA 1201H says that a prescription doesn't, leave you, out. Just because you're prescribed a certain medication doesn't mean you're also not also impaired and subject to the law. Did I answer that question?
Yeah, just when I heard that definition, I thought like to any degree. It
Sure.
sounded like, okay, that could be.
And remember, usually we're talking about 12 peers in our community who are judging that, and they want to see an impairment.
Sure.
There's just something physical that is being represented through the video from the investigation or something that has drawn their attention and led them to, believe that the person was impaired.
Okay. Axe body spray.
Sure. Yeah. And actually, Axe body spray is interesting.
Wait a minute, just hold on.
Sure.
What are we talking about?
The deodorant or, cologne or whatever you would call it that comes in a spray form.
You're kidding me.
You put it in your nose and you press and inhale.
Is that called huffing? Is that what?
Yeah. Dust off, the same thing.
What to you?
It impairs your ability to, function normally. Very short, term, sometimes minutes. We have people that will, be involved in crashes. I actually sentenced a person at the beginning of last year who was high on dust off. He was driving his truck, doing dust off, went into the other lane of traffic and caused a crash.
Do I look like I just been hit?
You do look like you're shocked. Yeah. Axe is actually, we have in our DRE curricula, advertisement that Axe was actually advertising use for that purpose. To kids, primarily.
Friend of my 17-year-old daughter a few years ago in Rutland was killed by a driver that was huffing.
So largely, I think that one of the reasons why our highways are, safer is because of the fact that we have implemented the A-Ride training program. I think that that's been very effective in allowing officers to identify the drug impaired. And I think that's why we're seeing greater numbers in our cases, because those cases don't go forward if an officer doesn't first see the person and think that maybe they're on some other drug other than alcohol. Because it was really a time where officers would give a person a PBT, the preliminary breath test, see zeros, and say, maybe they're just odd or something. There are 4 causes for impairment, right? One is medical, and John touched on that. One is psychological. Another one is drug, such as the drugs we've discussed and alcohol. And the 4th is a combination of all 4.
Angela.
I'm picturing this all, trying to envision the act of evaluating someone
Sure.
visually, and so I wanted to just go back, like, I guess one step maybe to what leads to that interaction. Is it necessarily an officer observing a traffic violation, or behaved swerving, failing to use a turn signal? Like, is there any?
All of the above.
Anything, right?
Yes, all of the above. So they have to have what's called an articulable suspicion. Under the Constitution, under the 4th Amendment, officer has to have an articulable suspicion. That is, they need to reasonably articulate a reason why they pulled the person over.
And that has to be a violation
Well,
of the law.
either a violation of law or reason to believe they might be impaired. So for example, weaving off of the roadway a little bit, which could be a violation, or if it's a dirt road, there are no lanes of travel and the person just might be weaving around, even weaving within the lane, something that's out of the ordinary. And that's just to engage in an initial investigation. In order to go to the next phase, they have to have a personal contact with the individual. They walk up to the car, they observe. They're trained to observe what's in the vehicle. How is this person interacting with you? Are there things that don't seem within the norm, right? And so they have to develop a case further to be able to articulate there's a reason to order the person out of the car to conduct a further investigation. And in terms of alcohol, it would be an odor of alcohol, bloodshot, watery eyes. In terms of cannabis, the Supreme Court of Vermont has upheld, for example, the odor of burned cannabis and other indicia of, trying to thwart an investigation, like air fresheners, Visine, that sort of thing, right there where the officer can see it. And again, this is just to engage in what's a limited detention for the purposes to determine whether or not the person's safe to operate a car.
What's the standard for that next step that you took?
Again, it's an articulable suspicion that a person might be under the influence of one thing or another. And then they exit the vehicle and they're asked if whether or not they want to conduct in-field sobriety tests. And people are free to say no. That's constitutionally protected. You can say, I don't want to. And then an officer's left with what they've got so far. Oftentimes that'll lead to an arrest to be able to determine whether or not the person has alcohol or other drugs in their system. Sometimes it may not. But then with those who agree to the field sobriety test, there are a battery of 3 tests. The first is the horizontal gaze nystagmus test. This is a test that was discovered in the 1950s. And it was discovered then that certain consumers of alcohol exhibited something that we don't all really see generally. And that is a jerkiness of the eyes. I was trained on the horizontal gaze nystagmus test back in 1992 in a previous job when I was an alcohol research associate at the Vermont Alcohol Research Center, which was located in Colchester. There we had a machine too that measured horizontal gaze nystagmus. It's a phenomenon where a person, you first check to make sure that it's not some medical cause. So you want to make sure their eyes are tracking equally. right? In other words, each eye is following the stimulus. You want to make sure that their pupils are the same size because they might have a head injury. They might be having a stroke, for example. And then you start testing whether or not they can focus on the stimulus and whether or not it's smooth when they're following that. When a person's consumed alcohol or other central nervous system depressants, what you'll see is a little jerkiness along the way. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean impairment. Does that jerkiness start before 45 degrees? That's the next thing they're going to determine. Is there a distinct and sustained nystagmus at maximum deviation? That means when they take the person's eye as far out as they can see, is it continually bouncing for 4 seconds? Okay. Normally, a person, you might see a little bit, but then it'll go away if they're not, they haven't consumed central nervous system depressant, or they don't have some sort of ocular degenerative disease, which the vast majority of people know they have. They have to wear corrective lenses or maybe not even be licensed to operate a motor vehicle. After that, an officer establishes probable cause. And that is that it's more likely than not, right? It's probable that a person has committed a crime. And that crime is driving under the influence. Then they'll bring them into the station house and they'll either provide a breath sample or they won't. That's an evidentiary sample that Dr. Conti talked about. In those circumstances, they have a 30-minute consultation with an attorney before they can decide whether or not to give a sample. Many people do give a sample of breath because there is a resulting civil penalty for civil DUI, which I can explain the difference if you're all curious. And that penalty will lead to a civil suspension, which is what most people in the DUI 1 scenario, first-time offenders, that's what they're most concerned over, because am I going to lose my license? In Vermont, we have two. Sure.
Maybe you can explain this, that the DUI 1, they wouldn't lose a license unless they have refused the breath.
So a DUI 1, they may lose it in the civil side, but they wouldn't necessarily see a criminal charge for refusal. They may see a criminal charge for under the influence.
But there's no criminal charge for refusal.
DUI 1.
DUI 1 is the...
So for DUI 1, there is no criminal charge for refusal.
Right.
2 and above, there is.
Okay. All right.
But there is a civil.
Right.
Okay. So at one point, it became pretty apparent to the legislators in the state of Vermont that a number of people were delaying the DUI prosecution to delay their suspension. And this was maybe in a more quaint time, or maybe we were ignorant to the facts of how many people may have been using other drugs while driving, which is interesting because our first DUI statute back in 1912 actually mentioned impairment by drugs, but I diverge from the subject. Under the circumstances, if you have somebody, right, that's blowing an 08 or above that is refusing, they'll get issued what's called a notice of civil suspension. That other track of law was created to more rapidly suspend dangerous drivers on our highways. It's a lower evidentiary standard. It's a civil standard. We can proceed on affidavits under most circumstances. And so what it does is it provides an alternative avenue that a person will receive a suspension, and there are no criminal consequences for that. In those cases, a defendant can take the stand, for example, and that testimony cannot be used against them. It can't even be used against them to impeach their testimony if they take the stand in the criminal case.
So you said that before somebody does a breath sample, they have a 30-minute consult with an attorney?
Correct.
Is that everybody gets that sort of free of charge, or is
Yes.
that if you can't pay?
Yes, it's free of charge under, so what's called or termed as implied consent. Okay, implied consent is this concept that driving is a privilege, and in exchange for the privilege of operating on our public highways, we agree that we will submit to an alcohol test in this case, right? That's been somewhat limited for blood testing under Birchfield, versus North Dakota, which requires a warrant for purposes of blood testing or consent from the individual. But what we're talking about here generally is the alcohol test. And so free of charge under the Public Defender Act, persons provided with legal counsel. It can be either someone of their choosing, but not necessarily. If we can't reach somebody, law enforcement's instructed, do your best. Try to reach the person that they want to have reached. Most of these arrests occur well after business hours, and most attorneys aren't going to answer their phone. Public defenders do. And so the default is call the public defenders on call, and then they will advise the individuals.
The answer is implied consent in the small print when I sign for my license.
I think it's more of a social contract. Yeah. It's under 1202 if you want to look at it, 23 VSA 1202, and also 1205.
It's in the green book, right?
Yep, it's in the green book. We all should know it as citizens, apparently. So people receive a fair amount of information, hopefully from the on-call attorney about whether or not they should submit to an evidentiary test. Most people do submit. There are a few who do not. So back to challenges. Some of the challenges that we face as prosecutors is meeting victim expectations. The last year, for example, I prosecuted 2 cases that ran the gamut, okay, that come to mind. One was a woman who killed her 7-year-old son on the interstate, operating at about 3 times the legal limit at 3 p.m. In a crash. And as you can imagine, the family didn't really want to see many criminal consequences. And so the result really reflected, let's keep this person who's never offended. She was over 40 years old, and this was her first DUI. But like a lot of these cases, what was really driving the behavior was substance use disorder. Someone that is 3 times the legal limit and is able to get behind the wheel, and their spouse doesn't necessarily recognize how impaired they are and allows them to drive, is a pretty experienced drinker. I talked about the wet labs down at the academy. We take volunteers, by the way, and if anybody's curious and want to partake in that exercise, you may be pretty surprised at how impaired you actually are when you're at the legal limit of 08. I was a pretty experienced drinker. Before I became a lawyer, I owned a nightclub. I owned a nightclub for 6 years. So I was a pretty experienced drinker, and I was really surprised to learn what 09 was. I thought it was way higher than that, and it was an 09 when I partook. I've also been in the DRE school, and John really didn't do a lot of explanation. It's a very rigorous process. The interview process is pretty rigorous. Not every single person makes it through it. We usually turn away about a third, I would guess. Yeah. Not everybody makes it through the school. We had a person fail this last time. It's a 2-week class. You have to pass a number of quizzes. You have to pass the final exam with an 80% score. And then we also have field certifications where you go and you actually do the testing on people in the field that have used substances where you don't know what they've taken. We do it in Jacksonville, Florida. These are largely houseless individuals who are in a residency, temporary residency, and they get an incentive to partake. What's interesting is that the prosecutors, one of these challenges that they run into is this is really complicated material. Trying to determine how people are impaired by drugs requires a certain understanding of physiology. It also requires a certain understanding of the drugs themselves and how they might show up. And a lot of people run into questions of, so why don't we just have blood tests that say, okay, you're impaired or you're not? A lot of drugs, there's no correlation between the amount of drug in the blood and the impairments a person experiences. And there are a number of different reasons for that. One is that blood's largely water, and a lot of substances are what they call hydrophobic. They don't travel well in water. They seek fat or other substances to find themselves in. And a lot of times cannabis is one of them. The impairments are occurring up here. And people are loath to give brain samples generally. So, so that's one of the, one of the impediments, if you will, to prosecution is understanding this process. Right now, our prosecutors are seeing on average 365 active cases each throughout the state. Our victims advocates, and I talked about dealing with victims, one of the victims that I was dealing with, he was a truck driver, professional truck driver. He was out on a motorcycle ride one night and an impaired driver by alcohol went into his lane and smashed into his motorcycle. He's had 18 surgeries. He lost his left arm and his left leg. He's in constant pain. Cost him his vocation, cost him his family. His wife got divorced from him because, as you can imagine, living with someone in constant pain, it's difficult to do. Their expectations aren't being met necessarily on the punishment end of things. Our focus generally has been, let's rehabilitate people. And I think that's why we're seeing a good number of people who aren't returning. The problem is those who are becoming more and more and more impaired. And one of the things that we're seeing is an increase in how many people are seeing their first offense at the same time. And we don't know how, and we can't keep track because there are various DUI diversions being operated by some of the diversion offices, some of the state's attorney's offices, and there's no one single mechanism to keep track. And so, for example, I've heard reports from officers where people that they investigated, they're in 3 DUI diversions in 3 different counties right now. So that system's not necessarily working all that well in that regard. But as you can imagine, if you're handling 365 cases a year, our victim advocates, or at any given time, our victim advocates have 600 victims on average right now. As you can imagine, it's very difficult to spend some time where you can engage in the training to be able to go to DRE school for 2 weeks and then a week in the field for 3 whole weeks away from prosecutorial duties. The time that they're not in court, they're in depositions. And proving these cases is also very challenging. Now, the legislature responded to case law back in 2020 by passing an amendment to 1201. It's 23 VSA 1201I. That amendment says that an ARIDE trained officer and a DRE who conducts standardized field sobriety tests or the standardized evaluation that the DRE conducts is presumptively admissible at trial. And some judges, though, are holding us to a higher standard than that. They're not holding us to the same standard that we have for alcohol. In fact, some are asking for absolute proof. And our standard has always been beyond a reasonable doubt, not beyond all doubt. That's one hurdle that we're having some difficulty overcoming. Another is having circumstances where we have people who...
Is the judge allowed to do that? I mean, that sounds like it's...
Not necessarily. It would really be dependent upon whether or not we then are able to appeal to the Supreme Court and get a ruling on it. But our ability to appeal on DUI ones is extremely limited because it's a misdemeanor. So the state is limited in the scope of what types of crimes they can appeal.
So how can a judge go above and beyond the
statute
Call of Duty?
I'm not sure. That's a good question.
Sounds like I should be on retention.
So I have a question on that.
Sure.
Depending on what types of crimes can be appealed, is that legislative or is that just policy or is that?
It's based on the rules of appeal.
Okay, it's the appellate rules.
Yeah, so we could go for what's known as an extraordinary relief, but that's largely frowned upon and pretty rare.
Right. Okay, I didn't realize that.
And when we're talking about the court, I think you all probably heard some recent testimony on court backlog. one of the areas or one of the mechanisms that could be used that the court isn't necessarily exercising is what's called the 42-day rule. In our civil cases, the civil DUIs are supposed to be heard within 42 days.
Question, Ian.
Oh, no, I'm sorry. I don't want to interrupt you.
Oh, okay. And so, as I said earlier, a lot of first-time offenders especially are most concerned with whether or not they're going to lose their license. That's the primary concern. And that's why we have the interlock program, for example, and the other licensing program for DUI drug offenders in order for them to maintain a license, but, still address what the underlying cause is, which is usually substance use disorder. If they engage in the 42-day process for the civil cases out there, which is primarily just refusals and our per se limit violations. We don't have a DUI civil for drug cases. We can discuss mechanisms possibly to a future date on how that could possibly occur, but right now we don't have the ability to do that statutorily. If they engaged in that, that would address the number one concern. It also addresses the evidentiary aspects of the state's case.
Number one concern being,
Losing your license.
oh, okay.
And it also is an opportunity because any constitutional violation or evidentiary problem that could arise in the civil is also applicable in the criminal.
So tell me, again, what is the 42-day process? Where is that?
So the 42-day rule is in the statute, on the civil statute in 1205. And so what it says is we have two time periods that are important for civil cases. First one is a 21-day rule. 21-day rule says the preliminary hearing has to occur within 21 days from the time of the offense. Okay, unless good cause shown or person agrees, the defendant agrees, or they're first-time offenders. These timeframes don't apply to first-time offenders. 42-day rule says that the final hearing has to happen within 42 days of the offense.
Except for
the first time.
Yeah, go ahead, Dave.
If I can, so I think, and my question kind of relates right to this, so I apologize for interrupting.
Sure.
Testimony, but so defendants are just waiving, right?
Generally waiving.
All those timelines and they have it run with a criminal case. So is that defeating the legislative intent?
It is. Yeah, I mean, they're waiving the timelines and sometimes they're not proactively waiving them. The judge is just presuming and saying, I take it, we're going to waive the timeframes.
So, and I think yeah, absolutely.
And these were relaxed during COVID for obvious reasons, but we're well past that, thankfully. I mean, people are still getting sick, but it's not the point.
And where is it that if you go through the civil case and you have an admission, like you admit and you're found guilty on the civil,
Sure.
that admission can't be used against you in the
That's also in 1205.
That's in 1205?
Yeah.
And so under the law currently, does the defendant have the right to waive the timelines, or is that?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. But it's largely being presumed, as opposed to being, actively, exercised.
Okay, great. Thank you.
And as Dr. Conti testified earlier, we are seeing an increase in these DUI drug cases and polysubstance cases. And that's not even the full story. Because if somebody blows an 08, we don't get a further test. So we don't know if they're also on other drugs as well as alcohol. And I think that we're seeing an increase both as a function of increased use, based on health attitudes and practices and other studies that have been conducted. We know people have fallen back into substance use disorder or engaged in substance use disorder because of some of the loneliness that they were feeling during COVID. And so we know that some of this is because of use, but we also know that some of it's because we have so many more ARIDE trained officers. And also, as far as the DREs are concerned, John was being maybe bashful in admitting that our DREs conduct more DRE evaluations than any other state in the country. And that's not per capita. That's a raw number. For example, we have DREs that have conducted more evaluations in the last year than New Hampshire, who has 69 DREs, has done altogether. So they're doing their jobs. They're answering that call, even if they're at home asleep.
Or is nobody driving under the influence of drugs in New Hampshire?
That's a possibility.
Yeah, that's great.
Just wondering. It seems unlikely. Ken, go ahead.
So because of the, did you say Ken?
Yeah, go ahead.
Is that because of the pipeline that we are coming up from Springfield and Holyoke and?
I don't think it's so much that. I mean, I think that people are generally driving under the influence of drugs throughout the country. We go,
Yeah, but I'm talking about Vermont.
why do we see drugs here?
Why are we with the highest per? Why is Vermont so high?
But why are we having so many evaluations done? I think because the DREs are answering the call.
Well, we have that, but also there's a reason why they're in Vermont.
We might have more impaired drivers. I don't have that information.
The first thing that comes to my mind is obviously they think they can get away with it in Vermont more, so they're going to do it more in Vermont. We're not enabling.
Yeah, I don't know the numbers on that. I mean, I can't back that up anecdotally. I know that we see certain individuals who, especially with the DUI drug cases, are repeating over and over and over again. But I think that's more a function of substance use disorder necessarily than response, because once you get into the felony numbers, you're spending time in jail automatically.
In Vermont?
Yeah, for DUI 2, which is a misdemeanor, you're 60 hours in jail.
So you have to drive everywhere here all the time.
Not a lot of public transport.
State,
But I don't have the figures on that. I mean, it could be, but I can't say either way. I mean, I know that our response isn't as harsh as it is in some states. New Hampshire does put you in jail for a longer period of time for your DUI 1, for example. But I'm not sure if there's any correlation between that and the number of DUIs. I attribute the response rate to some very dedicated guys and gals out there who
I'm very happy with that.
Yeah.
Don't misunderstand where I'm going with
they're
it.
doing their job and
That's-
they're hitting that call.
Yeah,
And that's without incentive is, they're getting paid the same as the person that's just sitting at their desk doing nothing,
I was gonna ask.
waiting for a call to come in.
Answer that question.
But DUI drug cases are also difficult to prosecute because of the evidentiary standard that our Supreme Court has set. And that is that we need an expert in order to testify and tie the use of drugs to the impairments observed. And where we run into problems is where you have people who are profoundly impaired, where they are passed out behind the wheel and they're whisked off to the hospital, or they've been involved in a crash. As John mentioned, 27% of our cases started with a crash. And they're hospitalized and we're not able to evaluate them, but our blood tests come back and there's a ton of drugs in their system. But toxicologists are permitted to testify that a person is impaired based on the amount of drugs in their system.
they are or they're
They
not.
are not. That's a function of both their certification and because for most drugs, there's not the level of research that's been done to be able to tie a correlation between the amount of drugs in a system and impairments. Because you have certain federally scheduled drugs, and it would also probably be unethical to start dosing people in controlled setting, for example, with fentanyl to see how they react. And
So what is the basis for that evidentiary standard? Is it constitutional? Is it just a
It's-
interpretation of their rules or legislation?
it's a judiciary standard that our Supreme Court has set based on Rule 702, the Vermont Rule of Evidence, that says that if an expert would assist the trier of fact through their training, experience, or education in understanding an issue at hand. That applies to both civil and criminal cases. The Supreme Court has decided that in every case for DUI drug that we would need to be able to explain what they see to a jury so they don't jump to conclusions. I think in certain circumstances that makes good sense. For example, I wouldn't want juries to draw conclusions on THC and what levels you see an impairment, because we have people that can be 2 nanograms per milliliter and be impaired and 20 and not show impairments. There's really no correlation there. But there are other drugs, and if somebody's passed out behind the wheel, I would have greater concerns. And we are seeing some states like Virginia, for example, that are implementing schedulized. So certain substances, certain controlled substances, if you have any amount, you're seeing zero tolerance response. You're presumed to be impaired.
Is there science to back that up, that that's the case?
Again, no. We don't have the correlations that would be necessary to be able to do that.
So is that something we're gonna evolve into at some point?
I think that's a philosophical discussion. It really depends upon what, issue we're trying to address as far as highway safety is concerned. But I just wanted to alert you that there are individuals who our officers are seeing that are profoundly impaired based on very limited information that the courts are tossing, saying, we don't have enough information. It's largely based on we don't have a toxicologist to say, yeah, that level is too high. Pharmacologists might be able to. Dr. Conti would be able to answer that question more appropriately.
So do those cases is there a possibility that they could be charged as a negligent operation or something else?
Yes. So we could charge based on the operation of the motor vehicle as negligent. But once we get into causation and describing what caused it, the same standard holds true in State v. Cameron, that we have to have an expert to explain the evidence to the jury.
Or why they were being negligent? Or
correct. What was causing the negligence? In other words, it was their drug impairment that caused them to be negligent.
I guess I'm not understanding that. So somebody gets in a crash and you have to prove why they got
so
in a crash.
We don't have to. It's certainly helpful because jury's going to always wonder why. I can kind of maybe explain it by helping you understand what our evidentiary standards are. For negligent operation in the state of Vermont, we have the same standard as we do in civil court, right? That is that you owe a duty and you've somehow breached that duty through your behavior. For gross negligent operation standards higher, it's essentially recklessness, right? So there's a recognizable, and you've kind of gone too far, right? You've acted with a gross deviation from the way an average person would act under the circumstances. So for negligence, not as heavy a lift as in some states where you have what's called a criminal negligence standard, which is that recklessness standard, but we still have the question of causation. When you're describing, well, they went off the road, being able to explain why is part of the puzzle. Juries, in my experience in Vermont, I've tried a few cases, they usually want to talk about causation. They want to get into that conversation if they can. And where we can fall short in a case where somebody went off the road is the area of alternative explanations. While at the time there may not have been any evidence, for example, that a deer ran out in front of the car, now suddenly a deer ran out in front of the car, for example.
Thanks. So just a time check that we're going to have to be done by 20 after 4.
Okay.
I do want to hear about kind of status of the ignition interlock devices and how that's going.
Yep.
And hopefully we'll also get to diversion. Willa, if we can't quite get there, we'll definitely have you back in. I apologize if we don't get to you, but.
So the only other concern I wanted to raise was with the diversion programs and the unofficial diversion programs or the pre-charge programs out there for DUIs. The only concern that I have is SR22 insurance. And that's not being addressed in those programs oftentimes.
Didn't you change something on that just recently?
Yeah.
Just
In law?
Yeah.
As far as the requirement for SR22 insurance?
I'm trying to remember.
So there was a change that required even greater coverage where a serious bodily injury or death occurred. Those individuals are flagged for a higher level of insurance coverage. SR22, I'm not sure when it was actually passed that you would have to get that insurance, but it was before my time as a prosecutor in Vermont. which dates back to 2013.
But the issue is, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, but you were saying.
Yeah, the issue is that we're not necessarily flagging for higher insurance, high risk individuals. And so the load isn't being applied evenly. You know, the insurance risk load from our perspective, as far as public safety is concerned. The way insurance works is that higher risk people pay more in order to cover the overall risk. And if those people aren't being flagged for that purpose, then we're not covering the risk overall.
If.
Very good question. One of the issues you highlighted was the victim expectation in the example.
Yes.
For the truck driver. I just want to understand, so in that instance, was that individual charged with like gross negligent operation with serious bodily injury resulting, or were we unable to charge that driver with that and you're hoping that a DUI charge could somehow incorporate?
This was this was not so much case specific as it is a problem that we see consistently.
Yeah.
So I don't handle cases directly generally. I handle some of the, more tragic ones.
Yeah.
But generally speaking, on the front level, what I'm hearing from our prosecutors is that they're flummoxed by, the outpouring of motion practice, where you end up with, 1,000 death by 1,000 cuts essentially. And so they're kind of falling behind because there's motion hearing after motion hearing after motion hearing going over whether or not, and they're in the position where 365 cases, they got a triage.
Yeah.
And so do you do the domestic violence case or simple assault case where, it's pretty simple facts, or do you delve in and handle this case that's going to require hours and hours and hours of preparation?
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
And just to address a couple of the questions that came up, one was about whether or not lay officers can provide sufficient evidence to obtain a warrant, if I understand the question correctly. Yes, they can. Where we run into the problem is not from the warrant viewpoint. It's that under both State v. Rifkin, which is a 1981 case, and State v. Cameron, which is a 2016 case, we need an expert to identify those impairments and tie them to drug use. Not specific drug use, but a drug caused that.
Actual prosecution as opposed to.
Right. In front of a jury. A layperson could say, I thought they were impaired, and talk about their observations, but they can't talk to what they think caused it. And that would include, for example, inhalants. We've had cases where people were, puffing gas, one for my car, one for me. We have people observe it, they get in a crash, and the people can say, I thought they were impaired, but they can't say, I think it was because of the gas.
They can say they saw him huffing gas.
They can.
You have to have the expert to.
Yeah, exactly. Tie the two together. And, as was talked about briefly, our DREs are trained, the process itself, you take blood pressure, you take pulse rates, you take temperature, you take a number of different indicators that will point in the substance use direction as opposed to, medical or psychological disorder. And the preliminary part of the investigation, you talk to the witnesses that are available to you, you talk to the arresting officer, and you have an interview with the suspect under those circumstances, and you learn a lot about, okay, wait, I think there's something else going on. We have had people whose lives were, saved because they were having a stroke, for example, but they thought they were impaired. The second question was whether or not doctors can conduct these types of investigations. In Finland, they do. The DRE, the drug influence evaluation, the field sobriety tests are largely based upon process that is conducted by physicians in Finland. For years, you're arrested in Finland, you're brought to a doctor, the doctor diagnoses whether or not you're impaired. We don't have such a diagnosis. We don't have insurance coverage, for example, for that. Our medical doctors are generally loath. And from a public policy standpoint, one of the concerns I have with regard to, having medical professionals, for example, drawing blood is that we're taking medical professionals away from treating patients, and then we're putting them in a position of having to collect could be criminal evidence. And then we're also turning them into state's witnesses. And so we are seeing certain individuals who are loath to do that. And they're obfuscating the whereabouts of suspects in criminal cases because they don't want to be a part of the process at all. And we've had cases in Chittenden County, for example, where nurses have hidden and doctors have hidden the whereabouts of people that have been involved in fatal crashes so that we can't do blood draws. And, we're not charging those individuals. We possibly could under impeding, but we really think that this is something that maybe the legislature would want to weigh in on.
We may have to follow up on that one. Exactly.
Why wouldn't you charge the doctors in that case?
So there was a very high profile Utah case that led to a number of civil lawsuits. And we've decided as a matter of public policy that is above our pay grade, so to speak, to make that kind of a decision for medical personnel.
Fair enough. All right, we appreciate it. And if
Sure.
folks have more questions, Dennis will be back on Thursday
morning,
age 44 specifically.
Thank you. Appreciate the time and your attention. That's asked some great questions. I'm always happy to answer. Also, if you want to email me directly, I might have access to more info that way.
I appreciate that. So I did want to, I'm not sure which witness I should have up to talk about ignition interlock devices and give us some ideas of trends and how it's working.
Matt Rousseau from
All right, Matt, if we can jump to that, I apologize to the other witnesses, but identify yourself for the record and proceed.
Matt Russo, Deputy Commissioner of DMV.
So we just kind of want to get an update. There was a number of years ago, we did pass an law that tried to expand the use of ignition interlock devices. Want to understand how the program just generally is going, how much it's being used. Is there anything we should be looking at to try to improve how that and if you could describe what it is for folks who may not have been here 6 years ago when we did that work.
Sure. So DMV is in charge of the restricted driver's license program. And what that is it requires drivers with an alcohol conviction to install an interlock device, which is the breathalyzer device that goes in your car. And it's not required for a first alcohol offense, but we do have quite a few people that use it for that purpose, so they can drive during that 90-day suspension period. For a second, it's 18 months that it's required. We currently have 920 participants in the program.
920?
920.
What's the trend on that? Is that how many have there been over the last number of years? Has that gone up or is it stayed about steady?
Slightly up, but it does fluctuate. Like again, because it's not required for a first, it would depend on if somebody wanted to drive, they would apply for the interlock.
George?
All three. Same exact time.
Karen and then Barbara, I'll go alphabetical by the last name.
Thanks. Well, I was wondering what is there an average or typical, I know you mentioned for first time offenders, they can avoid the 90-day suspension. So would they use the interlock device for that same period of time?
Correct.
So what is the average length of time that drivers are out of the 920 current participants? Do you have any idea?
I'd have to get those numbers. I don't have the stat for that.
Okay. Thanks. That's all.
Okay.
Yes, kind of following up with that, so 920s that are on that. So I guess my questions are like, how many, and you said you don't have to do, but it's a way for folks to be able to get their license. Maybe this is what you were just asking, and I was writing down my question, is like, what is the pool of folks that could be using that? So like, how many are actually, you might not know that.
Roughly the same question. I don't have
Yes.
those numbers.
But then my other piece is that is just for folks who lost their license due to alcohol, right? And so there's no intervention that is available for anybody else, right?
Correct, for a drug only, correct.
So I'm wondering what the cost is and if that's been a factor in people not using it.
I don't know the exact number for the cost, but in statute there are a few programs they give them a 50% discount if you meet certain criteria, low income. And it's easy to apply for. It's an application. It makes it easier for them to be able to afford the device.
Does DMV run that program too?
No, we don't run those programs.
The discount.
Correct.
Okay, so that's through,
There's LiheAP, I believe is one of them,
Okay.
Foursquare.
So, the cost hasn't proved to be a barrier to individuals, or has it?
I have to imagine there are some barriers, but we're not involved in that.
Right, okay.
Is it a one-time cost or are there monthly charges?
There are monthly charges, low. It's for calibration, so you're required to go in once or twice a month to recalibrate the system. And if there's anything that malfunctions, they can go in and have it recalibrated.
And what is the monthly charge? Or, and is there an initial charge and then a monthly charge?
There's the charge to have it installed for the equipment itself, and
Yeah.
there's a recalibration fee when you're going into the station. I
Do you know
don't
about how
know
much?
exactly how much that is.
Okay.
I can get that for you.
Yeah, supplement.
Yeah,
There are a number of contractors. This is an area where competition in the marketplace is beneficial to the end user. It has driven down cost. They have to provide cost sheets, and we can send those to the groups. You can see how much it is.
Great, no, that's helpful, I appreciate that. So let me just, maybe it's already been asked, but, so has there been an uptick in the use of this over the last number of years?
Yes.
And why is that? Is it more people are driving under the influence, or is it the word has gotten out that this is something that can be used? Do you have?
I don't know for sure. It is for a second offense, it is required.
Right.
So they are aware that it's available. But I'm not sure exactly why there'd be an increase other than more alcohol offenses.
I remember, is that one of the changes that we made? If anybody knows, Dennis, I don't know if you know, like, it was 8 years ago that we did this. Is that when we required for second?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, and we also made it available for the first time.
Made it available, right.
Excellent to get them immediately.
So any issues or anything that we could do, and I'll open that up to anybody, that can help expand the use of the interlock devices?
Did we implement the program for, to help people out as far as money goes to afford it? It seems like we did.
I don't recall.
There was,
Yes, yeah.
Pennywise was providing some grants for that purpose, but they've run out of funding. And there is the 50% reduction if you receive certain public benefits.
Any idea how long the 50% has been in effect?
I don't know how long that's been.
Just be interested to
Yeah,
see
yeah.
the before and after.
Folders and help.
We want to see if that actually what we did was helpful. It sounds like maybe it was. Angela?
Well, I think that's what my question is about, sort of, but, before we talk about potentially expanding this program, do you have a sense, does the DMV have a sense that it is working? Like, how many times are people violated? How many times,
I think I can say that it's working in the sense that if the vehicle's not starting or if they're blowing, having a BAC, we're going to see a record of that.
okay, so it's all
The portal
reported
and the
back.
manufacturer.
Okay,
So in the sense that they're not able to drive the vehicle, I would absolutely say.
we're not able to drive that vehicle.
That vehicle, yes.
Right. Yeah.
Have you heard from anyone about we were talking about the third-party contractors that do the actual install of the breathalyzer, about like the practice for the contracts? So where like for DUI 1, it's 3 months, but they have to sign a 6-month contract and they gotta pay for it for the 6 months, even though they only need it for the 3 months.
I don't know specifically what's in each contract.
Have you heard anything anecdotally about that from anyone using?
I haven't.
So you don't have any particular ideas that how we can improve the system, which seems to be functioning pretty well on its own?
I don't. I think that it's a good system. It's worked well.
Okay, right. Appreciate that. Any other questions? So we do have 15 minutes left and I have some additional witnesses and I'm not sure, I don't know that everybody wanted to testify. Or has something to add to what we've been learning so far. Anyone? Anyone?
I should talk about fatal crashes.
Please, so you must be, I haven't met you, Mandy?
No, Mandy Chapman.
Nice to meet you, Mandy. Thank you. Yeah, that would be great if we could.
Rejoin.
Yes, thank you. So you were there and you had your, see, I saw Mandy online, so, okay. Yes. So, and just before you start, so Will, I figure that since we're having you in on H25, you can do that background for us when we get into that. So, yeah.
So for the record, my name is Mandy Shatney. I am the manager of the data and analytics section at the Vermont Agency of Transportation. I oversee the crash program as a whole, but also the fatal crash reporting program that we do for the federal government. So I'm going to share some statistics with you on fatal crashes and impaired driving. Here. Yes, all right. So we put together we collect all of the fatal crashes from the state that are reported on every road by every police department in the state. And we pull that together. We do analytics on it. This is one of the things that we put out on a weekly basis, reporting out different information on fatal crashes. What we're really here to talk about is the driving under the influence or impaired driving. So we do as Trish talked about earlier, we do separate it into alcohol only, drugs only, and alcohol and drugs. And many years ago, I was asked to pull out cannabis as its own line here. As you can see, I'm not going to go through all these numbers, but as you can see, cannabis did kind of spike in 2021. It's come down a little bit the last couple years. So not, oh. All right. Hopefully you can't see that, but I wanted to just show a percentage of fatal crashes where the driver was impaired. What you can see is the trend line is moving up. We did have a drop last year. Our total crashes, fatal crashes did also drop last year. We had been moving upwards starting in 2020. So it was good to see a lower number. As I always say, though, 59 families lost loved ones. So we're, it's nothing to celebrate necessarily. And then, I don't know if you can see this, but I can. It's the little me in the corner. I keep having to move it. Oh, you don't? We just see. Okay, perfect. All right, so Dennis had asked me to pull together the different types of drivers and fatality counts. So drivers with, go back.
Is that for 1 year? Is that?
This is just 2024.
Thank you.
And I will say 2024 is not finalized. We're still waiting on toxicology. We usually do for a month or two following the end of the year. So these numbers can definitely change. But the first chart there is showing driver counts, just drugs and alcohol. So alcohol, the first one is drugs only. The second one is alcohol only. The third one is both. And then 13 drivers had none. So that's the next one is showing crashes with more than one vehicle. So I think there was a question or some consideration about multi-vehicle. So not all of our impaired drivers are just driving off the road and hitting a tree. They're hitting other people and killing not necessarily themselves, but somebody else in the crash. And then the final one was a fatality, alcohol and drugs toxicology result for everybody. Oh, sorry, fatality count. So the number of people who died where a driver had just drugs, just alcohol, or both, or none.
Oh.
So if you look at that top one where it says none, there were 13 drivers, but 15 people died, right? So it wasn't necessarily a driver, it could be a passenger.
Yeah, Barbara, question here.
Does it include I know, because I know that pedestrian and bicycle fatalities are up. So would those be included in the?
The fatality, the bottom one,
Okay.
yes, yeah.
So that.
We definitely collect that as well, though. We, I've been doing this for 25 years and we finally put it on the crash report where we could collect it for other people other than the drivers of the cars, which is really good.
So how long have you been collecting that?
More than 10 years, yeah. All right. And then I was asked to pull some data on drivers with suspended or no license as well for you all. So I did a really quick poll. So 11 drivers in 2024 had suspended or no license, and of them, 5 were impaired. So about 45%, as you can see, that number has actually come down from 2022 when 16 of our suspended or no licensed drivers were impaired. 12 of those were impaired.
So those are all the fatal crashes.
In fatal crashes.
Fatal.
Yes.
Well, that's a pretty large percentage.
Yes.
Of suspended license.
And then my last slide, I just wanted to show you, if you haven't seen this yet, we have a strategic highway safety plan in our state that the Vermont Highway Safety Alliance oversees. My team put together a website with dashboards for each of our critical emphasis areas, and one of those is impaired driving. It's publicly accessible, so if you want access to it, it's out there. This is showing this bottom, on the bottom right for all of you, I believe. The red gauge is showing that we are not meeting our target as of right now. Because our fatal crashes or our impaired driving crashes are up. That's it.
So additional questions? So I have one. So the Highway Safety Alliance, do they have an annual meeting still?
They are, I believe, and don't quote me. I believe they're switching off and on with the Highway Safety Office. So the Vermont Highway Safety Alliance does one year, and then the Highway Safety Office is doing one the other.
We make sure that this committee gets invited again, because I went to it a couple times and it was very good to get some of the information at that.
Yeah, I can let Allison LaFlamme know that you guys would like me to.
Appreciate it. All right. I thought you had a question. All right, so thank you very much. And I can give either Jamie Lee Bedard or Lieutenant Paul Ravelin the last word if either of you wish to testify, or if you think we've covered everything you would.
I appreciate the offer. Basically, we're the end user of this entire system that you heard today.
So why don't you come up and join us and
Oh, great. I was trying to get
you only need to talk for 5 minutes.
I can be quick. I can be quick.
Shit.
I did. I'm spot, right?
If you could identify yourself for the record.
Sure. Lieutenant Paul Ravelin, Vermont State Police. I'm the Executive Officer of Special Operations, which includes the Traffic Safety Unit, which is what it is called now after John had left. So I'm kind of the version of John now. So in listening to everyone before me, I too was a DRE. That was a very important part of my career. I got on early and I worked under John as part of that program. So I understand it very, very well and the importance of it. We're the end user of that system you just heard, as I mentioned. So this is really the system, right? We'll see an impaired operator. We'll see someone driving erratically. We'll see someone having a violation of Title 23 will make the traffic stop, and then that's where our investigation begins. It could be something as simple as driving with a broken headlight, could be something as simple as tinted windows, could be speeding, could be weaving within their lane. Any one of those things causes us to have an interaction with an operator. That conversation can lead to a further investigation of impairment if we see signs that, hey, maybe this is what it is. That's when this system comes into play. If we take someone into custody because they done poorly on standard field sobriety exercise on the side of the road, then we go through the process of a breath alcohol sample, and that may end up in the data master, the DMT. If we suspect it's drugs, that's when we make the call to the alert system and have a DRE come in and do the DRE, which leads to a blood draw, which leads to the health department coming in and doing their piece, right? So then we go into the prosecution piece, and that's where Dennis comes in. So all these things come into play, and we are the end, like I said, we are the end user. And from that, some of the stuff that I had pulled up, just to give you some idea, last year we had 1,550 Title 23 1201 arrests, driving under the influence arrest. That would be alcohol and drugs.
How many did you say again?
1,550 was what was reported in our Valcor system. That's our CAT RMS that most agencies use in Vermont. That may be a little bit more because there's a couple that are on a different recording system. Those are DUI ones. All right, DUI twos, those numbers statewide are around 423 of DUI twos or more. So we're seeing, like, are you seeing that decrease? You know, we're not seeing a lot of recidivism of DUIs. Some of that comes into the interlock system working, some of that into the diversion program working. Some of that is into some folks. I remember one DUI I arrested. The kid had he was a college student, never had a warning, never been pulled over ever in his life. And he was like a 0.120. Like he hammered it, right? Like he went big. Never had another violation in his life, but that was the one time. And one and done. Like he learned his lesson, went through the system. And there's other times where my first ever DUI arrest was a DUI 5, right? That person didn't learn and they just kept going through the thing over and over again. To the interlock system question, violation arrests statewide in Vermont last year, according to the Valcor system that we use for CAT RMS, was 173 arrests on an interlock violation. One arrest that I had was someone was in a rental car. So they were required to have an interlock system. Their car was inoperable for whatever reason. They're into a rental car, and now that rental car doesn't have an interlock. And they were in violation of that, of needing that to operate, right? So
Curious on that. So what was the rationale or for pulling over that person? Were they speeding?
Yes.
To catch them, right?
Yes.
It wasn't like, oh, I know that person's.
Correct. It was in Interstate 89 southbound Colchester Way Station, and they're in excess of 85 miles an hour. So it wasn't.
You're driving without your interlock device.
You said it, sir.
All right, 173 arrests, and we had, what was the number? 700?
920.
I mean, so is it often the same individual or those all same people? How many people did that count for the 173 arrests? I'm curious. If you have that.
I don't have the number on how many would be the repeats or how many would be that. I just know that I don't know if they're DUI ones that are in the program or if they're DUI 2 and subsequent. I don't know. But those were the interlock arrests, 2024.
So what are the other violations? So this one was driving a rental car. What are the other kind of violations that you see of the interlock?
Unfortunately, I don't have those numbers for you, sir. I
know, not numbers, just examples. I'm just kind of curious that.
It would be any interaction that law enforcement would have with a motor vehicle violation, a Title 23 violation of some sort.
Was it mostly driving not the car that has the device or somehow getting the car?
Oftentimes is an interlock requirement that you're not using it. So it would be another car that doesn't have the requirement that you need. So if you're borrowing a buddy's car, a rental car, something like that.
Seems like a high number, 173 out of the 900, but.
Might supplement.
Yeah,
We're hearing
please go.
also that a number of people have cars that can't pass inspection, and that's a prerequisite to getting the interlock.
Yes. So they're driving those cars still
without the
Okay, so,
devices.
but they don't have the device.
Correct.
So they're not one of the 900 and some that we were
Right.
talking about
They're
before, but,
Maybe
okay.
the person who's been arrested for the interlock violation, that's in 23, 1213G.
Quickly.
Yeah, Tom, yeah, go ahead.
So roughly 2,000 DUIs a year out of the state police.
There was 1,550 total. Of those 1,550, VSP had 550.
Okay, so this is all the way across the board.
Correct.
Plus you had the DUI twos, which is another 5.
Correct.
And if you had to apply a number to every processing, would it be fair to say maybe 2 hours each, give or take hour?
It used to be 2 hours. It can be upwards around 4+ hours.
Right, so if you take that and multiply that by the number of arrests and you have the new set of man hours, that could also attribute to the possible decline in arrests.
It certainly does. In my career, there was one 24-hour period that I had 3 DUI arrests in a 24-hour period. I think I would be hard pressed at doing that now, especially for applying for search warrants, getting them to the hospital for blood draws and things like that. That extends it all out. So it wouldn't be unheard of to hear someone, an officer coming off the road for 6 hours for the initial processing. Now you're talking about paperwork.
So it's mostly red tape.
There's a lot of that. Yes, that's been added.
So is that, those 1,550 arrests for DUI one, is that drugs and alcohol?
Yes, sir.
All right, thanks. So I'm sure Tom will come up with some ideas of how to reduce the red tape. Thank you very much. I'm glad that we had you because that was great information.
Pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. I really appreciate all the witnesses. That was very, rental car driver sober. So
He was on his way to work. I felt bad. But
that was a good question.